Um, so that's sort of the background to this presentation. I want to give you first about some aspects of our take on working on sustainable finance, why we do it, and what we see are the basis for why this is an important challenge we need to address. From a science perspective, what is the challenge which we see and what is happening right now in terms of developments globally, what the challenges are for our planet, and what the responses are in terms of sustainable finance. What's happening from the financial industry, what's happening from the policy side, and maybe what's not happening, or is it really happening, and so on. So I've been working for WWF since 6 years. I previously worked also coaching sustainable entrepreneurs who have a lot of these kind of solutions which we need to create a more sustainable future, reducing emissions and resource consumption, which is very inspiring. There's a lot of stuff. The challenge is not technology. We have all the solutions we would need to have a more sustainable and prosperous future, but we don't really deploy them at the speed and scale we need to. That led us and led me to looking more into, okay, so why aren't we? What's happening in the market and industry? What does it take? What would it take to get corporations, government, cities to sort of really use all of the kind of solutions which we have at our hands, but use them and replace the kind of solutions which are causing more troubles than benefits to the planet. So the idea is that I do a bit of slideshow here. Feel free to interrupt with questions related to what I'm presenting here. There will be a lot of numbers and graphs and stuff, but if there are things which you need to have more clarified in this presentation, and the plan is to have more of a Q&A and a dialogue discussion at the end, once I've dumped all these questions to you and see how you respond to them. What you find is interesting. Okay. Yeah. So first, a little bit about the science, and I would say from the upfront here, it's about sustainable finance, but it will be very much related to climate. About this, there's a lot of topics needed to be addressed in terms of more sustainable economy and finance for that. How we produce food and the water and the seas and all of that. All of that is also interrelated, which you will find. But the angle from here is, since I work for the Global Climate and Energy Initiative, we then have a particular focus on climate and energy. But these issues, around how to work with the finance as instrument as driver, is very much interrelated. So I think I would argue that most of these challenges that I'm presenting here are valid for all kinds of production or all kinds of markets and topics related to sustainability, but it will be through a climate lens primarily today. There was recently a conference in Copenhagen where WWF participated as observers, which was compiling then the latest round of research into climate from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. They have since last year, they were in Stockholm actually for the first report in September last year, and they released 3 reports on different topics. What can we actually say about, what can we know about, is climate change happening? What impacts does these changes have? And how can we mitigate, how can we change, how can we stop these changes to happen? Those were 3 working groups, 3 separate reports, and then they were then compiled into a synthesis report, which was released after a conference in Copenhagen just over a week ago. And then we were a team of people who were sitting in there as observers, just listening in because it's very rewarding to hear how the science is discussed. And this is then a meeting between the scientists, which are well over 1,000 scientists who will be working on these reports, compiling the results which we know at this point, and they are then meeting together with government representatives to sort of negotiate a consensus document which can be provided called Summary for Policymakers, SPM. A summary for policymakers means that this is something we can all agree that policymakers need to know and need to be aware of in terms for their policy making. So with that comes that one should understand a consensus document with 195 nations from government and science is a sort of lowest level of consensus, where there are a lot of research in the underlying reports to this, which can show much more explicitly and much more maybe radical effects, which are maybe more important to some sectors and some countries, but still are there. But what is then common for all, and what this samples which I will bring here are from the summary policymakers, which means that there's actually more, and there's actually more severe consequences which we should be aware of if we look into the deeper research. We're quite familiar with these kind of graphs. Unfortunately, we've become familiar with them, where we have the rising greenhouse gas emissions. And this slide showing the different kind of greenhouse gas emissions, where the carbon dioxide is the major one, but there are also other gases which are affecting global warming and creating global warming. And they are steadily and rapidly increasing. And there was some news this morning. How many are from Sweden here? Swedish radio. So there was some news on Sweden that actually China and the US had a meeting, and they had agreed to sort of start reducing their emissions. US have previously said that it should be reducing them by some 17% by 2020. Now they were up to 26, 27% by 2025. China didn't say any number, but they said we're going to peak our emissions by 2030. And then they will slowly reduce. So it means that this curve in China is, the US and China, I think, is that they are about half of the global emissions comes from US and China. And China is still sort of a growing economy, releasing more and more. And this was then evidence that they are saying that you need to be aware that we're going to continue to increase our emissions for another 15 years before we start decreasing them. And that's really worrying when you look into what science tells us about how the emissions look now and how they need to be reduced rapidly. The majority of these emissions comes in from carbon dioxide, mainly from the use of fossil fuels, but also from cement production and flaring in industrial use and new production. So that's why this often sort of global warming and climate change is often made equivalent to CO2, which is not entirely correct, but to a large extent it is correct that the majority of the issue, the gases, comes from CO2. And from both these slides, we can note and see, maybe particularly with this one, and this is a good graph showing that this is how much was emitted between 1750 and 1970, and then this is how much was emitted up until 2011, showing that the majority of the part of emissions come from after 1970. So it's clear to see how the emissions started to rise after the industrialization, but also more since 1950 and even 1970. The majority of these emissions come from the kind of economic growth that we have had all around the world, in all countries, since then. Also from IPCC, I'm sorry I didn't have time to put in the references here. We'll do that before I share it to you after this presentation. This is also, and the reason for why these slides are a bit blurry, because this is then taken from the IPCC webpage, where they posted this sort of finalized, agreed summary policymakers, but they're now working on it graphically, so it will be released a much nicer graphically designed report with better graphics and so on. But this is what's in there as sort of the working document, but which is still the agreed document. What scientists around the world have done is then they have looked into different scenarios. How can we achieve what will happen in the future if we continue business as usual, as we call it, the RCP, and this stands for representative carbon pathways, and there are a number of different kinds of groupings of scenarios. So the upper one here is that we do nothing, we just continue producing and consuming and releasing emissions as now, and they will then continue to steadily rise from where we are now. And down to where we need to go, where this discussed, you might have heard of this, about this 2 degrees threshold, or staying below 2 degrees global warming, which is then called the RCP 2.6. It's also measured in terms of, as you see over to the left, in terms of parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So below 450 is then equivalent to what's called the 2 degree pathway. Showing that we need to then peak quite soon. The emissions globally need to peak within the next few years to give us an opportunity, and this is still, I think, the best case in these scenarios says that we can achieve this by 66% chance. So we are need to do a number of things, and we need to really work real hard to be able to get down where a number of scenarios where we're doing less and less mitigation efforts are happening, less stringent policy is happening, takes us to any of the higher scenarios.
Did you say 66% chance of getting to the...
Why they say?
Did you say that we have a 66% chance of getting to
In the scenarios are designed that way, that they use a number of assumptions, and you use a number of how fast will technology become available, how strong will different kind of policy instruments be used to set price on carbon or incentivize for use of renewables and efficiency.
In the new report, because I thought they completely took out any implementation details. So in the IPCC assessment, I thought like there were absolutely no details on how to implement this policy.
No, well,
my understanding. So that's
no, and that's what might be what you're referring to. That the IPCC report doesn't tell a policymaker anything what they should do. You know,
no, but I mean that they don't actually quantify like the time lag or the cost or the social effects of implementing certain policies or the effectiveness of assuming they do pass them or whatever, like that they're actually be effective on the ground. To my understanding, none of these models have any implementation details at all, which is why I'm curious of where you got the 66% chance of reaching the 2.6 like you see to consume.
Well, they have it. I have a few tables later where they're themselves using a different kind of scenarios, which gives you maybe if they come soon. And speaking about cost, I will get back to that one in a minute. Where they're also speaking about the cost, how they're pointing to that the cost increases in these different kind of scenarios if you have used different kind of technologies like carbon capture and storage with nuclear, solar, wind, but they're saying that the cost increases if we delay mitigation actions, we delay policies which are making this transition to happen faster. The basic message here, which IPCC is sending, is that we need to act rather sooner than later, because the more that we wait, the more expensive it will get, and the more harder it will get for us to reach those kind of more secure levels of global warming. So that in this, and this was a quote from the Working Group 3 report released in Berlin on mitigation, and when they for the first time also took a look at the investments and investment flows work today going into energy which is mainly fossil fuel, and how this needs to be changed, which I will come back to in a minute as well. But they also made in the green column there some summary of research which has been looking into what would this mean in terms of cost measured as terms of reduction in global consumption, where they pointed to that it's quite moderate. The 0.06 here as an average for the 450 means that if you would have 3% growth in your economy, you need to go down to 2.94% growth in global economy to afford these kind of measures. The message they want to send across is say it doesn't cost the world to save the planet. We can still have economic growth by doing these things, and that's something which is very important, because otherwise it's in these reports it's often discussed cost for doing this. What does it cost? And the impact of climate change is also a cost, but it's more often mentioned as a co-benefit, which is not calculated in numbers or in amounts, where you save the ability to produce food, where you save health costs and so on, but they are not quantified in the same way as the cost of actually the impact from climate change. So it's important to that they are pointing to that we can actually do things to avoid those kind of damages to food production and health and so on, and thereby still having an economic growth. And they even went further in the census report and pointed to that if we don't do these kind of measures, then economic growth will be hurt, because without these kind of mitigation measures, it will be difficult to maintain economic growth, which we need to eradicate poverty and so on. So that's an important message, which is quite difficult to pick up when there's a lot of talk about impact and cost in the report and research, because that's maybe a scientific language, but the effect or the consequence of that is we need to have we need to do these measures to be able to have continued prosperity and growth, because without them, then the business as usual looks as if we can just continue and emit, and then we will have some environmental problems, but we will still be able to have economic growth, and that's not the case. It's rather the opposite, that if we continue business as usual, we will not be able to sustain economic growth.
Why not?
Because of, and I will come to that as well, because that's the important part, and I want to maybe see if it works now with our technology here now, just to share from the session.
Human influence on the climate system is clear. If we want to limit climate change, we need substantial and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to deal with climate change. The impacts of climate changes that have already occurred are widespread and consequential, but we have opportunities for adaptations to address these that also contribute to robust economies and vibrant communities.
It really comes down to a matter of choice. We either continue on the path that we're on and possibly face catastrophic consequences of climate change, or we listen to the voice of science and act accordingly. That's really our choice.
And so, maybe to your question, what are the challenges? Why is it like this that we need to act on this to be able to maintain economic growth and development? Now into some WWF research. I have a few copies with me here, also quite recently released. We can share them around, and they're all on the net, and I can share them with Justin, so you can have them electronically. But we do biannually, together with another science organization, look into state of the art of the global footprint, what is happening to the capacity for our planet to reproduce what we are consuming, sort of mapping our consumption versus the biocapacity of the planet. And the summary, and there's a lot of the whole full report there, and there are by country and so on as well. But the summary of this is, and has anyone heard about the Overshoot Day, which was now in August, I think it was already, late August this year, because it moves a bit and tend to come early. When it started in 1970, late something, it was in December, and it comes early and earlier. Because that means when this point happens on the year, on the annual basis, meaning that we have now consumed as much as the planet has generated for us this year, and now we're living on next year's budget, so to speak. We're living of future generations. We're consuming more than the planet can provide for us. And this is then measured in a number of different ways. You see a simple formula here. It's about the population, it's about consumption, and it's about how we produce what we need in terms of food and things. There's, as I said, a ranking of all the countries. You can see here different parts which are part of the ecological footprint, how we use built-up land, fishing, forestry, grazing, cropland, and carbon emissions. Again, from this small graph there, you can see that carbon is also quite big, but also cropland and grazing. We're in Sweden now, even though you're not Swedes. And guess where Sweden ranked in this list? Or if you can read very well, I know I didn't read it from here because the numbers of the countries are set up. So these are the 200-something countries. And this is then from the highest footprint down to least footprint, and this is the average. Where do you think Sweden places itself?
Probably in the first third on the left.
On the the first third. You agree?
Yes.
But that means that this is also part of a challenge for which we have very much when we work on these topics from Sweden, but also globally when we work on these topics. It varies very much, of course, where you are. If you're talking to some countries over here, which of course are they're very struggling to produce for their people, taking out the poverty and so on, is a different discussion. But all of those countries, developed countries and so on over there, we have an impression that Sweden is really good and really in the forefront of environmentally sound consciousness from Swedes and how we produce and all of that. But that is from a production perspective, and what the footprint does, it looks at production and consumption, how we produce things, but also how we consume things. And since we are a high income country, high living standard, we consume a lot, and most of that goods and services and food comes from abroad. So we actually generate those emissions by consuming or creating demand for those products, and that leads to us having then a very high individual, as a country, and as individual high footprint.
So if we buy from foreign countries, then that adds to our footprint.
Yes.
But is that footprint also counted in those other countries? Double.
So the same is done for all the countries, yes.
Yeah.
But the other countries who have who are producing the things for us, of course, they also have their footprint. But then it's mentioned how much we produce and how much they consume. So if we think that the case of China, they're also quite high up, and they're now reaching having a higher consumption and production in total than was sustainable.
Kuwait and then Arab Emirates.
Yeah.
So those countries are really the worst.
Yes. Because they have high consumption.
So is it
and production of things which are generating.
And then add into that, and we buy from those countries.
Added from that.
When we buy oil from those countries, then
we contribute to the footprint, yes. So it's a different way of looking at it, but it's a way of looking at it also from, and it can be done domestically as well. If you look compare between cities, how the cities might have a ecological footprint, where it means that the message behind this is that we cannot only look at our production, we also need to look at our consumption, what we consume and how we consume, how much and what we consume, because that's driving production in other countries. And there are, which some of you might refer to, there are arguments that from a country like Sweden, for instance, our steel industry is very efficient in terms of energy, so it has much less emissions and makes steel, which in turn, in the next step when it's used, is generating less emissions. So we should be accredited because we are providing less emissions to the world globally by providing this kind of more efficient steel production, and it might be other production that we do. And that's a valid point, but it sort of doesn't take out the high consumption that we have of other goods and services. And we all realize now that we can only be self-sustained with everything we produce within one and the same country. Maybe that's something we would like to go to. Maybe that's also a discussion to be more local and locally produced. But a lot of the consumption and the lifestyle we have now, and maybe there might be a good reason for having production of some things, this is made distributed globally. But this is to help us to address not only the production side of things, but also understand that we as consumers, individuals, but also as companies, cities and public consumption is a large part of driving the ecological footprint. And what this means then, maybe coming still back to the question more, that all the things that is included in the footprint here, how we build, how we provide food, how we provide materials, energy, is then it's visibly seen in how things are changing in our ecosystems and for biodiversity around the world. For instance, how forest areas are decreasing because we are building more things on them, because we are taking down forests to produce food, because we're taking down forests to generate energy, and using those forests for those kind of purposes itself, but also in taking down forests and in changing the use of land, that in itself releases quite a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So, and when we have forests in place, they are absorbing greenhouse gas emissions. So they are also so-called carbon sink, which is why you can buy trees and plant trees as a way of offsetting your carbon emissions. So between 2050, you can see clearly how the big forest areas around the world are shrinking, which is both creating a negative development for the globe, but also creating negative conditions for those who are living in these areas. Fishery is another way, because the IPCC then have clearly pointed out that a lot of the global warming which has happened recently in the last decades, we haven't really seen the effects of those so far because they have been absorbed by the seas. But that means that the seas have become acidified, or acidified. And that affects then the ability to regenerate fish stocks, where we can see then that the fish stocks are depleting. And that's also a big worry for a lot of, not least developing countries, because they're very dependent on fisheries for themselves, but also for their export. And then, as we already discussed, a large part of this footprint then comes from the carbon emissions in this, which is why we're working on basically all these areas on cropland and forestry and so on, but also very much on carbon, which I said we'll address today. And maybe here might be the answer to your question. This is also one blurry graphic from the IPCC report, which I hope you will find better when they're done with it. But they're pointing then to risks in physical systems, for instance, the glaciers in different parts of the world, how big the risk is and if it can be reduced, the potential for reducing that risk. Glaciers, which are then creating rising sea levels and flooding. Biological systems, terrestrial and wildfires, marine ecosystems, human and managed systems, food production and livelihood, being able to have fresh water. The fresh water is sort of a scarce resource. We only have a set amount of fresh water, and a lot of the fossil fuel production is using a lot of fresh water, and a lot of the production of textiles and other things, food, is also using a lot of fresh water. So that's why it becomes a pressure in areas which we don't have that situation in Sweden, but in many parts of the world, including China, access to fresh water is a big threat to the societies there. So they're trying then to point to what this kind of global warming, climate change, the use of fossils, how it's threatening us, and all of this then together is making it harder to make a business, to make economic growth, and making a profit, because things get more scarce, more expensive.
Yeah, I just want to ask, I think you said before that, so basically growth has led to the CO2 emissions. And now, right?
Growth.
No. Yeah.
Growth. Yeah, economic growth.
Economic growth led to CO2 emissions. Okay, and the CO2 emissions are the problem. Basically, climate change. So now you're saying if we reduce CO2 emissions, then we can have further growth. Isn't that saying that we can't? For me, that means we can't have growth. I mean,
and it's a matter of
we for growth you always need resources, and you're taking them sooner or later.
That's because the kind of economic growth we have now is a resource-intensive economic growth. So that's why the whole issue, which I think you're aware, maybe I discussed before, is how do we generate economic growth? What kind of economic growth? And these are the examples saying that evidence showing that the way that we're generating economic growth now is not really sustainable. It generates these kind of impacts and pressures, which is not only a pressure or a threat to ecosystems, but it's also a threat to economic growth in itself.
But then basically, it is just to say that in the future we will have a different growth. So we're not sustaining growth, but we're creating a different growth.
Because we need, economic growth in Sweden and many countries is almost a bad word sometimes. Economic growth is necessary in terms of all the political discussions. We're talking about how, and on the news every day you can hear about what's happening to economic growth, how it's going up and down in Sweden or EU and so on. So it's very much embedded in the society we have today. But we need to realize that we will not be able to have that economic growth for much longer if we continue with the same kind of economic growth that we have now. And there are many drivers of this impact to the planet, and there are many drivers. So part of it, economic growth is not just one thing; it's many parts of it. and the ecological footprint also included population growth, which is also, of course, the increase in population is also part of it there. But it's, then again, there are also ways of seeing that we can provide food and energy and for all, which is sustainable if we do it differently. So it's not a matter of reducing population, which is quite hard to do as well. So, but it's a matter of finding if we're going to provide for this population, which is now going from 7 to 9 billion and so on.
But
How
not,
can we do that?
I mean, the population is not growing in Western countries, which are the one that have, so we don't have to worry with this.
But we have to worry about our consumption.
Be for sure. But,
But the economic growth is not. It's not the key thing that's driving it here. No, the population growth is not what's driving it in Western countries the same way. But then in our part of the world, it's more that we continue to have economic growth and the kind of pattern that we had previously. So we're continuing to increase our footprint, even though we're not growing our population. We're continuing to expanding our footprint. And these kind of things will then have effect on different ways. Already, as we see now, because we're already up to almost one degree of global warming, and so 2 degrees is really a tough issue. The science still tells us that we can still keep global warming under 2 degrees, but we are already at 1 degree, and we'll continue. If we stop using fossils today, it will continue to keep up warming as well, because these gases are staying in the atmosphere for maybe 1,000 years. So we need. That's why it's all again very important to cut down on these emissions very rapidly. So there will be a lot of consequences, like sea level rising, which will affect a lot of countries, including Sweden, Nordic countries, where a lot of parts of the world, parts of the country here are discussing how we need to build and adapt to the climate change which are coming when it comes to flooding. Maybe not so much in the sea level rising, but when it comes intense rain and flooding. We have seen this already this summer in Sweden with flooding on the west coast. At the same time as there was a big wildfire in the middle of Sweden, which was the biggest one in 100 years, which is also these kind of extreme weather events which are connected to climate change. So they will impact, just this level will impact a lot of parts of the world.
Especially Singapore, vulnerable.
Yeah.
Because they have very good university. Are they very concerned about that?
I think all of these regions are concerned, aware that they are vulnerable to these kind of changes.
They ought to be very.
They ought to be, and especially kind of Indonesia, Bangladesh are already very, very hit, and they are already, they have that's part of it when it comes to from the climate science to the climate change negotiations about a global agreement on this. That's why it becomes very tricky, where these kind of countries see that they're impacted already and will be more impacted in the future, and then they need to be supported in how to mitigate this. But they can not how to adapt to this change which are happening. But they cannot do it alone, because a lot of the things which are happening, the characteristics of climate change, global warming, is that if we release things here, it will affect also Indonesia or Bangladesh. So that's why there needs to be actions taken from high emission.
Expect them really to take part in the negotiations really actively.
And they are. So all countries are active in these negotiations, coming from very different perspectives. Then and there's then the tough questions is how to work together. Where of course the developing countries see that we need to have your support in terms of funding to be able to.
But on the other hand, I've heard from personal context that in Bangladesh they are seeing prospecting, taking out oil from the under ocean findings, and they are really we're going to become rich.
Yes.
So it's paradoxical.
It is. It is, and India is one of the most. A lot of these countries also lack energy, because energy has been providing for us to be able to have a growing economy. So they also need energy, and they see that if they have these kind of natural resources within their own domestic area, they want to be able to use them, because so did we when we built this.
So really crazy.
It's crazy, but it's logical in a way, because they see that we want to do this, and a lot of the countries in Africa now are exploring that they are striking oil, so they want to be able to explore that to build their economy, which is a valid argument in a way, which means that again the countries who are have built our economies on fossil fuels and have the ability to shift to other kind of renewables need to do that much faster to allow for this kind of the carbon budget which we have remaining to be used by those who might need it the most.
I think it also makes sense for them to, because if they manage to grow, then they have more adaptive capacity to adapt to changes. So, for example, about Singapore, it's a very different story than when it was about Bangladesh, because Singapore probably will not have so many trouble with adapting. You can just buy the neighboring countries and something like that. And Bangladesh has this problem, so they have a lot more adaptive capacity if they manage to grow with this oil use. So it can make, from a single perspective, actually.
Well, Singapore is a quite well doing sort of country, so they have resources, yes, but buying up country, that's not as easy because the country is scarce and they're moving entire population. So it might seem we just do this, we just do that. So everybody realizes, when you start to really look into what is to do. And then again, it makes sense for these kind of countries to exploit the natural resources that they have and allow them to do that. But then the question is that the best option to go for? Or are there other options? And then it comes into the discussion about technology, how fast is technology coming, which can provide them with a better option of developing and maybe not doing the same mistakes that we did before and so on.
Could you provide more quick? So this scenario is for what year? That is if we continue if we don't go down to 2 degrees in emissions. So
yeah, so the by 2100 that scenarios
show
that
okay.
So that it will rise. So let's say that by 2050 it will definitely maybe have risen this, and the risk is that it can rise even further.
I just would like to make a proposition if everybody agrees. I think we're all here very well versed in the science behind this and the challenge and we've all read, I think, the IPCC report, and I will really be interested to switch in the sustainable finance the solution. So I don't know if everybody agree on this. This is pretty clear to us, right? The challenge.
It's a good point. Thank you, because I tend to think like that myself, but I'm not as courageous to say it. So let's skip. You know about the carbon bubble as well. Carbon Tracker, a think tank in UK, who then pointed out that this is where we need to stay to remain below 2 degrees. But this is as much fossil fuels which we actually have in reserves in our. This is only in stock markets, in listed companies, showing that we have like 4 times more fossil fuels than we can use to be able to stay below 2 degrees, which is why it's called a carbon bubble, similar to the real estate bubble and so on. But actually, these are assets now we're coming into sustainable finance. These are assets in our stock markets, in our pension funds, in our banks and so on. But if we would go for 2 degrees and see that now policymakers are getting themselves together and now we're actually moving to 2 degrees, we cannot use those. So they are not they don't have the value which we think they have. They are overvalued. So that's the carbon bubble. And the interesting thing is that, again, a strange a graph, but from the IPCC report, they have actually put this out here, where they have said that for the 450 scenario of staying below 2 degrees, we have a carbon budget of 1,000 gigatons of CO emission to release to the end of the century, I think it is. And but the fossil fuel reserves are between 3,700 and 7,000, so more than 4 times more than we can release. So this was something that Carbon Tracker released in 2011, but now it's also sort of backed up by this scientific report, which shows that we cannot. And one of the messages, if you look into from the IPCC, is that we need to phase out fossil fuels. And then
this is a course of finance now. I expected some finance.
Okay. Okay. So this is then where I mentioned before the cost. How they talk about different kind of what it will cost in terms of the reduced consumption to make this kind of achievements, and here the 0.06 in loss of consumption, as they call it. And then the question is, how does then the financial community respond to this? What is happening out there when they know about this? I believe that you have been hearing me discussing about green economy and different kind of concepts in that direction from different speakers previously. So I will not go much into that, but that's one takeaway discussing the whole economic model as such. So this is from a report where it sort of puts it in an interesting way to discuss different approaches, because you might hear about green economy, you might hear about green growth, or just continued growth as usual, which is what policymakers and industry often talk about. And of course, sustainable development. In just a rough way of putting in different actors, we see ourselves, of course, as working on sustainable development. A lot of UN organizations are focused on green economy, that concept, and the OECD, the countries, the industrial countries, are talking about green growth. They see this as an opportunity for boosting their growth, and you might blame Wall Street and other sort of industries to sort of just want to have maximize growth as such. So it's an interesting way of trying to think about different kind of approaches. How are they taking on the issues? Are they, and how there might be a conflict between having sustainable development on one side and then having growth, because we need to have maximum growth, which means that it should be supposedly in conflict with sustainable development. There are a number of different initiatives, as you probably also heard about, addressing this, both from public sector and from academic sector and from the investment sector. And recently in New York there was this climate summit invited by Ban Ki-moon, which was, as part of it, also raising a number of commitments and initiatives from the finance sector for how to address these challenges. And there was a big climate march there. So the IPCC then have also clearly pointed to that we need to change the investment flows to be able to achieve these kind of scenarios. They don't say it in that way, you should, because that's not the way IPCC speaks. It should not be policy prescriptive, it should be policy relevant, is the key word, the key phrase. So they are then using scenarios to say that if you have a scenario which is leading ourselves to under 2 degrees, then this is what will happen. So you can translate that as, okay, if we in the future have achieved staying below 2 degrees, we will have done something like this of shifting investment flows from fossil and so on. Sorry, this is in Swedish. We made a survey which we are currently analyzing from Swedish government politicians, public agencies, private business and financial sector, asking them, the question here is I think it's a claim that they should make their position on. I think that we can solve the long-term environmental and climate challenges with today's economic models. And interesting to us, it says, I don't agree that we can solve these challenges with today's models. Some, almost 20% of financial sectors say that no, we cannot do that. And a large part are also uncertain. So they themselves, when they are asked, recognize that it's difficult for us to switch and solve these challenges with the current economic models that we're using.
But you're missing in public in general. Every normal person.
Yeah, we have not asked those. This is for sort of, this is a survey around strategic decision making and how sustainability is integrated in economic decision making.
So the politicians, they agree very much.
Yeah, it's interesting because the politicians tend to think more. They're more confident that we can solve this with the current models. Some are not, but they're more towards the positive to that. And from the business and financial sector, some are more. This is a distribution, of course. So this is why we think it's interesting. We want to understand, what do they already know? Are they on this? Are they working on this? Are they receptive to developing or changing economic models and incentives to use economic decision making, financial flows to address these challenges? And we can see that it's said by Bloomberg, which is a sort of respected name in this kind of financial analysis, that by 2030, 75% of all power sector investments will go to renewable energy systems, which is promising. So it's sort of shifting and going and increasing very fast towards renewables. But fossil fuels are also growing and still growing. So there are still going huge investments into further extraction, further production of energy based on fossil fuels. So that's what we tend to see in countries within policy, that they are seeing the opportunity of renewables, but they're also exploring further use of fossils, which lead to a trend where we're producing and using more energy, but we don't see the shift happening where we're using less fossils, having less emissions. Because this increase in renewables is good, but if you have an increase in fossils, it will also generate more emissions, of course. So that's why we then took the help of, and pass these around as well, use of PwC to take a look on Swedish invested capital and how it's been allocated in terms of investing in energy globally, to understand, so what is the response, how are they investing today, and how are they working, how are they working on this issue of shifting their investments and responding to the science. And this is then summarized in a WF summary, which is only here in print in Swedish, unfortunately, but we are just about to translate it, so I will show you a few examples from this in English. So because we'll try to sort of describe this challenge with this kind of investment capital, where Sweden is the example, but we think it's not only valid for Sweden, and we wanted to raise the awareness and discuss how this can be done with different stakeholders. So I want to just get back and wrap up here in 10 minutes so we can have the remaining time for discussions, to show some things where we're trying to make this much more explicit and take on this conversation with both policymakers and representatives of the financial industry, mainly then pension funds, insurance companies, and banks. Where we started off by looking into what have we invested in and what does that mean in terms of how is our money that we are saving, how is that involved and contributing to the problem, the challenge that we see around climate change. And as I said, you have the graphs in there. This is the English version. I will send it to you. It basically says that we are the emissions which Swedish invested capital, 4,000 Swedish crowns, 4,000 billion Swedish crowns, 4,000 Swedish billion crowns are invested abroad. 9% of those, 370 billion, are invested in energy. Most of this is invested in listed companies, because that's what the mandate is for these kind of pension funds. They are not very rarely allowed to invest in unlisted. So most of it is listed. Most listed energy companies are, guess what? Surprise, surprise. The big major ones are fossil dominated companies. So the PwC then did an estimate looking at where these funds are invested in different stock markets around the world, and came up with a number that our funds are contributing to the emissions of, which says small down here, 53 million tons of carbon emissions per year, which should be compared to the Sweden's own emissions from our own production in Sweden are 56 million tons per year. So you can say the same amount of emissions which we are generating ourselves in Sweden, we are generating through our savings abroad. That equals then, over an active lifetime, this is supposed to be bars showing that if you start working at the age of 20 and you have an active lifetime of 62 years, which according to Statistics Sweden is where we live to 82, this means that for 62 years we are saving, and that money, according to the pattern today, are then generating these kind of emissions 7.9 tons per year, and that leads us to, over a lifetime, having contributed to the emissions of 490 tons per person. That shouldn't be compared to that we, in our consumption, if you go back to the footprint target, and this talks about transports, food and drinks, and housing and clothing, the total emissions we do there are 58 million tons, or 10.6 tons per year. But that's still a consumption which is being done in Sweden, but could be from goods and services abroad. Some of that could be, of course, the production could have been using some of the energy which we are owners of, and emissions we're owners of, but a very small part, of course, goes only to our own consumption. So you might say that the 869 tons of emissions we're generating through our consumptions are added by another 490 tons from our financial consumption of financial services in terms of savings and so on. And that's the annual emissions then. Year by year, we're contributing to this another 7.9 tons per person. And when we are owners in the BPs and the Shells of the world, we are also then owning a small part of those fossil fuel reserves which these companies own, which we saw before, are 4 times or more than we can actually use to stay below 2 degrees. And our share in those fossil fuel reserves are 753 tons per person. So we are both owning a part of annual emissions, and we are owning a part of the fossil fuel reserves, which will emit CO2 emissions in the future when they are consumed and used as they are supposed to be, because they are on the balance sheet of these companies. So that's sort of the basic analysis we want to highlight to put this on the agenda of policymakers and financial institutions. And then we have went on to, which you see on the big centerfold of this folder, to just try to understand how are the decisions made in sort of the financial decision-making process. From that you, over here, they're not putting your money into either a private insurance company or a bank or a fund, or as we all are having a governmental pension scheme of different kinds. In Sweden they're called the AP funds. So how they are setting up their ownership policy, what should we do, what's our responsibility, how should we act as an owner, to their strategic capital allocation, what should we invest in to have a diverse portfolio and invest wisely long-term to generate profit and avoid risks, and how that is then transferred into an investment strategy, which can then be, where the investments can be done by the fund themselves, or it can be a mandate given to an external fund manager to make the investments for them. And in here then we have then tried to highlight or set some warning lamps where we see that from these very general, typical issues of ownership policy, we should aim for high return, we should state what our obligations are, we should act to influence the companies that we are owners of, to stating how the investments are allocated between different kind of asset class, listed, unlisted, bonds, loans, real estate and so on. Acceptable risks for this. The AP funds have a very set way of how to distribute between fixed income and invest in listed companies and so on. And then of course there can be a wide range of different investment strategies for implementing this. And we then point to a number of issues which we see are still not fully addressed. For instance, that there's a big lobby from the oil and gas industry, sort of course, to not have this kind of implementation or regulation put in place, which is also something which is often mentioned by the Cristina Figueres, who is the head of United Nations Framework for Climate Change, leading the climate negotiations, that they need to be. She asked actually investors at a meeting recently to help them to scrub the lobby practices, so she's very concerned about the lobbying disturbing this picture. But the owners don't often have the knowledge. That's why we need to come back to the science, understand how these decisions that we are making in this process are having an impact on our planet and the climate. That they are limiting their responsibility to saying that this is what we are responsible for, and then their policymakers or it's the customers or their other stakeholders, which we're not responsible for. So they are limiting it. And they are, in our opinion, asking too little to get more informed about what they should know or what they should act on. When it comes to capital allocation, as I said, the majority of almost all energy companies, and everybody wants to have energy in their portfolio, are fossil fuel companies. And then you have different kind of financial regulations which say that you have to reduce your risk in your portfolio by having companies which can be traded and can provide solvency and liquidity in the market, which then favors these kind of fossil fuel companies. So you have actually financial legislation which has nothing to do with sustainability or such, but affects sustainability and climate in a negative way. The risk, when the financial sector speaks about risk, they tend to speak about financial risk, which is something which is financial risk within the policy framework which are today set, which I mentioned before. And they are not including the kind of risks which we might be thinking of here when we talk about climate risk or climate impact risk. They're not including them because they see that's, and some may even say, maybe to provoke reaction, that we have outsourced those risks to society, to you, to the owners, or to the government. So we are not taking that risk because that's not our mandate. We have not been mandated by you, our customer, to take that risk. So we are aware of it, they're saying, but we are not taking that risk because that should be someone else who takes that risk. And that could be discussed as well. And when it comes to investment managers, fund managers, they lack the incentive to include this kind of climate data because they're asset owners. If you're an asset manager, their asset owner doesn't ask them to include this kind of risk. They don't know about the risks. They don't know that this is something which is material to their assets long term. And that's why managers might also be aware of these risks, but they see that nobody asked us to do it, so we don't do it. We can just deliver return and create good results from the management the way we've done before, and continue doing so. And they have a poor competence of themselves, understanding that this is something which they can actually act on, create new products and reduce risks which will come just around the corner. So, just very quick summarize of where we see that there are no issues to discuss, and to end up, there are some good signs coming up since there's a lot of discussion in the financial community right now. This is from a new report from HSBC, which is titled Keeping It Cool, Financing a 2-Degree World, where they're starting to talk about, okay, what does it mean to finance aiming for a 2-degree trajectory of these different kind of pathways which IPCC is talking about. Speaking about how you can do around adaptation, to avoid emissions, to have less emissions, to control emissions, and to sequester emissions in carbon capture and storage or forestation. And of course adaptation as well, which also need to be financed because we are already seeing impacts of climate change, so we need to adapt to those. And they use World Economic Forum data to say that there are numbers to show how much more we need to spend to achieve this 2-degree scenario. But if you go back to the IPCC data, you can see that this is not a higher cost. It is rather an investment you need to do to have a return on that investment longer term, because you will be able to sustain your operations in this sector of this country. So it shouldn't be seen as a cost, it should be seen as an investment which provides a return on investment long term. And the papers, I recommend a reading of it, we share it with you, where they say that it's a perfectly valid question to ask, how much will the emissions reductions from this project, if it's a project from a financial institution, from a financial instrument, how much will it contribute to the global goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees? And there are different kind of initiatives coming up, for instance, from the New York Climate Summit, something called the Portfolio Decarbonization Coalition, where the AP4 from Sweden has been very much active, and together with the UNFI and others, where they are looking into two things and inviting financial institutions to come in and first of all do a disclosure to make a mapping of seeing how much carbon, similarly we did here to the Swedish funds, how much carbon do we have in our portfolio, and make a disclosure of that so that they're informing their clients and policymakers, and then take act in different ways, whatever means they find useful, to decarbonize that, to reduce the emissions. And so that's measuring and then taking action. And then what we are hoping to see as a next step is that having more discussions in lines with the HSBC paper, what does it mean if we're going to finance this towards a 2-degree future? This is a PwC chart where they're talking about this dotted line here is the way that we are decarbonizing our economies as it goes, because things are becoming more efficient. So just by developing new products, we are really using less energy. So that's a good move, but it's not good enough, it's not fast enough. So we need to make a much deeper cut in emissions and in consumption, which means going that kind of way. So all business usual portfolios are going this way in terms of emissions per unit. Then we have the consumption and the population, so they're still growing. But so we need to go that deeper path. So in a simple illustration, if we are like this now, we have a lot of fossils and we have a little bit of renewables. At some point by 2050, we need to have the opposite. Maybe a little fossils remaining, but the majority must come from renewables to be able to achieve this deep cut. So what does that mean? How are financial institutions working to achieve that? And I will stop here and end here, where we need to sort of somehow come back to discussion that economy is not really what we're seeing and doing and working on now, because it's more kind of financial growth economy without respecting that it's originally something about caring for your house and having some sort of norms of laws and order system for doing that in a way which makes good sense for the economy of the planet long term. And we should start realizing that and creating the kind of financial instruments and strategies for that, and not seeing them as a cost rather than an investment.
It sounds like you started your lecture.
Sorry?
That sounds like the start of a lecture.
I've got the problem that you defined. I also have you defined what needs to be done. So defining as investing, you give sources of energy as an example, and converting fossil fuels to green energy. So this is a problem. What needs to be done? Also, you kind of define our means to do this is to play with finance, or how do we direct the found money we have to a specific investment. You also detailed the problems about why those investments are being channeled toward the broad economy. But what I'm lacking in this picture is the solution to fixing this means in order to fix the problem itself. So my question to you will be, what should we do to change those patterns of investment? You were talking a bit about like increasing transparency, but I think more like how can we change the incentive of managers and investment bank and those decision makers that really create the current, that direct the current of those investments.
Oh, nice capture. Did I get all that? So I will maybe go back to this the English version of the folder. Where I think that we need to work upstreams on these kind of topics which are summarizing, meaning that I think that these guys here, investment managers, we shouldn't really hope for them to start doing this within the same mandate that they have now, because they are service providers. They're managing funds to someone who's asking, "Hey, can you look after my money for me and make a bit more of it?" And they don't. If I don't ask you much more, they will not do much more, because they see they are in a competitive business. They cannot do much more without having someone asking for it. So on the ownership, asset owners of different kinds, which are both you and I ourselves, and our governments in terms of pension funds, if we have government pension funds, but also policymakers in terms of legislators for the financial markets. There needs to be a discussion of the pricing of things, the way we're maintaining economic growth now. Is it really making economic sense, or are our models flawed? Are they lacking information? Are they lacking perspectives, which are creating a false economic growth? We're creating an economic growth which, at the end, the bill for that economic growth comes back to ourselves. So if you look at it from a more societal market perspective, there are good reasons for seeing that these kind of measures which we need to do, price on carbon, taxes on carbon, and so on, makes good sense, because they are not restricting competition or growth. They're actually creating long-term conditions for economic growth. So that's one part where I think the solutions need to come from, that we are putting in place. And it cannot be done only by governments. I think they need to understand and work better with the financial community and with companies who are proactive in seeing that we have these kind of solutions. We can provide them, both large and small companies, but they are not rewarded for them. There is not demand for these solutions, because the ones which are based on the fossil fuel and resource intensive solutions are still benefiting from the current conditions.
Because they're more profitable.
Because in short term they're more profitable. Because if you're using energy, or if you're using resources without paying for that resource, if you're using resources without including the actual full cost of that resource, it will make it, when you pay for a service or product, it will make it cheaper. Yes.
So one of your solutions is to internalize the cost of those industry through a carbon tax, you stated, for example, in order to make those investments less profitable and make then green investment more competitive. And then as a manager, then the choice will be, since the profit are the same, or even green energy are more profitable, I will channel your fund there.
Mm. Yeah, so pricing can be different ways, or if it's taxes, or if it's fees, or if it's licenses, or if it's consumers, but different ways of sending the right signals and right incentives for that production, for that company to produce the unit. And for us to see also when we're consuming something at the end, that you have the price tag yourself as a consumer, which is more reflecting on the actual cost of it. Any questions? There.
I was just wondering, right now there's like a lot of labeling, like a lot of labels, like ecological labels or fair trade or etc. And I think now, last time I checked, there's something like 16 or I don't know, different types of ecological or fair, like social, like going back to this kind of incentives for the economy to internalize that somehow kind of. But to me, it seems like the problem, even like the definition of what is, then are those things actually sustainable enough, or to actually define what sustainability would imply in that context, and how to discriminate between different kind of brands of ecological production, fair trade. I mean, how is one better than the other? How do we like then I don't know ensure the quality of this, or is it just gonna be like using the you know this green movement to create a new market for like more like a marketing than actually something that becomes beneficial to support nature.
Is there a question about the role or importance of labeling?
Or like it seems to me like even if the government today decided to, yes, we have to have sustainable capital, or the X amount of funds need to be sustainable, what is actually then gonna that mean in the market? Right? Who's gonna certify that this is sustainable or not? I mean, because we had it with the REIT and all of these offsetting, trying to offset like case studies, or trying to implement like carbon offsets that they actually contribute to more climate change. Is it actually, do we have the capacity today to implement some kind of system like this?
Yeah. Let me maybe, in the interest of time, make a note of your question and have the two other questions just raised and come back to them.
So my question was regarding the logics here, specifically about investing in climate adaptation rather than mitigation. What kind of financial logic would be behind that if you want a return on investment? And looking through the kind of notes that's written in the HSBC report here, that they want to invest in storm surge barriers, infrastructural planning, seawalls and barriers. What is do they expect to get returns on such investments? And if so, could you kind of explain that logic to me, not being from a finance background?
Special adaptation.
Yes.
Do you see a role for a public green investment bank?
Short and sweet question. Okay. Any more questions? Just like to. So on labeling, I would say that labeling is has its role. Standards definitely. I mean, if you think labeling in terms of consumer, but also maybe for business goods that you have, so this is approved by someone somehow. It could have its role, but this is my personal opinion. I think that it's speaking about economics and maybe these kind of impacts and understanding them for a company, and going back to what I said before about your question that we should have more policy interventions of setting price and taxes and so on. I think from my reading of the IPCs and stuff, there is all of the interest should be in any company, at least a company with a long-term perspective, to understand the kind of impacts and the costs for me in sourcing materials, in having a market to demand my products and so on. So I should understand better how I build my company, so my products are really relevant for the future we're entering into. So that it's sort of built on economics, genuine economics, rather than because labeling tend to be very often that we are creating a label and we can charge more for that. And it could be in some cases that we need to charge more because the end user something is underpriced, it's not really reflecting the entire cost. But if there are other benefits as well, which are actually paying back, and there's a whole there's a lot of these kind of projects or initiatives which you can find which are actually practicing this already. If you look up something called the ZERI Institute, Z-E-R-I, Günther Pauli working with sort of business models as a way of not only seeing a business model, how we make it mass production and as cheap as possible and so on, but rather to try to see, okay, if this is something where we should make it really sustainable and which has different side effects, but we don't necessarily need to include in them, but if we include them, can we make that into a business case, which is actually making it more interesting and profitable? And then if you do that, we can find, okay, it can be done. But who are then my stakeholders? Who are then my partners in this? Which will probably be quite different from what you are in the traditional business sense. And those kind of projects and business models are very inspiring to see that this can be done, but it needs to be done quite differently. We're talking about transformation and incremental change. And here you can see that this is a transformational business model where things are done really, really differently. And then you can also start understanding why often large companies with established business and vested interests have a different difficulty in switching to these kind of really transformative business models. But doesn't mean that they cannot do it or they decide to do it over a 5 or 10 year period. It's been done before. So I believe my response would be that labeling, definitely we can use it, and WWF is working on standards of different kind of bringing stakeholders together to create more sustainable production or working with different stakeholders in agreeing what should be done in all our interests. But I would personally rather see that it's sort of built into the economics of the operation itself. Logic on adaptation. It is much more adaptation is much more difficult in terms of who's actually benefiting from this, because it's the general that benefits from it in whole. But again, I would say that if you're a large company operating in many parts of the world, if you're sourcing your production or goods from a certain part of the region of the world where you are dependent, which are very vulnerable, you will see that it makes sense to do these adaptation measures, because they will allow us to continue having production or having a market in that space. Then the question is, how does the financial mechanism look like to source the funding to making these investments? And that I would hope to prefer seeing them as investments rather than costs, so that you can see that they're actually paying off for that company or for that sector, and of course for that government or the country as a whole. So then I guess there will be more. I have more hope for the business sector, financial sector themselves to figure out the business model and financial instruments for making a good business in investing in climate change mitigation. But on adaptation, maybe there's more of a role for public interest to create those kind of mechanisms and explain them to financial community, maybe through different kinds of international financial institutions, World Banks and others, who are saying that we need to make these measures. That's already happening in the negotiations. Does that make sense? Can I come back? Is it to this, or because we have a third question? Okay. And role for Green Investment Bank. There is a few of those, and they can definitely have a role, and they're often sometimes requests are asked for from private financial institutions, because they can be issuers of green bonds, and they can be providing risk guarantees or risk first loss guarantees and these kind of things, when they see that we need to make this kind of investment, but it's compared to our own current mandate and capacities, we are not able to do them. We are not allowed to do them, given the financial regulation we talked about before. So then they can come in like a third party who are taking that role of bridging what needs to be done, what wants to be done, but what cannot be done. But there should be that kind of bridging and matching function, because sometimes it could be, it sounds as you want the Green Investment Bank to come in and do the investments instead of the financial market. And that I don't think will be successful, because the financial markets don't want that. They want to do the investments themselves. But it could be someone who enables, I think.
What happens if the corporation is trying to internalize for good economics, for good absolute economics? They try to look at what are the impacts of the cost of production of this. But what if it's the case that for 80% of the industries, there's always going to be a negative cost from producing something, because and that's my point. I mean, depending how you take it, which kind of time perspective you take into account, or which kind of dynamics, or how your model is set, there's going to be a point where if you want to calculate the impact of this in the long term to society, it's going to be absolutely negative in that terms. And then maybe it's good for you as a corporation or whatever to exploit this resource. That's what I mean. It comes to a methodological question, like how.
But that's a typical case which you see with the fossil fuel industry today. That one issue we still haven't come to terms with a lot of these proactive or engaged investors, the insurance companies and pension funds, who say that we see this, we're acting this, we agree with you, and so on, is that when we come to the fossil fuel industry, they say that we remain in fossil fuel companies because they are also the biggest investors in renewables. That's their argument. And we actually take PwC to take a look at that as well, which we can't really find is accurate, because this pile of dollar bills there is supposed to show that the biggest major oil companies like BP, Shell and ExxonMobil, they invest between 0.5% and 4% of their annual new investments into new projects. They go to renewables, and they use less the rest of it to continue exploring and taking out more fossils. And some of them have said openly they've been into wind and renewables, and they have sort of dropped that and said that we are good at drilling, we're going to continue drilling. We have a very well-known Swedish CEO in BP who are saying that this is what we're good at, we're going to continue doing that. When you talk about the carbon bubble, they say that, well, that's not really going to happen because we see that the long-term demand for fossil will be sort of just going on. So you don't have to worry. If you're an investor in us, you don't have to worry. So we tend to wonder if the pension funds who say that we are engaged, we are working on this, we are engaging in dialogue with these kind of companies. What kind of dialogue do you have with a company like this when they're going so completely in opposite direction towards what the science says and what most national governments have said, that we are going to deliver on the 2 degrees target? They are not committed to an agreement yet, but they're saying that we agree that we're going to stay below 2 degrees. So in that case, the business model and the business they're in is evidently negative for society, but they continue seeing that they don't sort of listen and want to react to that. So that's when if it doesn't help speaking to those companies, then it's up to them asking the investor, are you going to support this? Are you going to be an investor? Are you going to invest my money in continuing this business? As we see, it's the only route for. Because I agree that but in most cases, companies tend to see that we can change, we can see different kind of materials and productions, develop new products over time. So they see that they have the opportunity of shifting their strategies and going into a new sustainable route in a few years or longer time, how they do that. But when it comes to the energy sector, it seems that either you are doing this or nothing else.
I'm not so optimistic with regard to investments, because isn't it like that those companies, although they suffer on the consequences of climate change, it's also a big investment opportunity for them in case it's actually already happening, in terms of adapting to severe disasters and so on. Because we know kind of from environmental disasters that usually GDP is increasing as a consequence, because the costs are carried by society, which needs somebody to rebuild the capital, and so they invest into the private sector who makes profits out of it. So I think it actually makes kind of sense for a private actor to not care too much, because climate change also provides a lot of opportunities for future investments.
Well,
because destructive capital has to be rebuilt.
I would say that you need to take a look. If you're that company, you need to take a look again, because yeah, for sure, individual companies and some company sector, including some countries, will benefit from some of the effects of climate change. But then you only take a very narrow look on a particular occasion or event or a particular region or a particular sector. Like the growth season for agriculture will be longer in Sweden, so that's a benefit to us in that way. But if you take the wider picture of what the impact will be for a country like Sweden, or when it comes to food production in the world, providing for poverty alleviation, when it comes to mitigation, people mitigation, climate refugees, and so on. You have so huge impact which will disturb economies that the individual company might benefit, yes. But then, so you might go ahead and say, I'm going to stay with this and wait for the orders to come and rebuild when the flooding has come and so on. For sure. But then it's again, it's up to the policymakers, legislators, or it's up to us as owners, because there's always someone owning these companies to sort of start realizing, what am I owning? do I really want to be a part of this? Because, as we said, with Swedish pension funds here, we are ourselves very much contributing to the emissions by having ownership in these companies, but most people are not aware of it. If you ask the man in the street, most people say that I don't want to contribute to climate change or environmental devastation, but very few are aware of that their assets, their funds, which they are saving either through the governmental pension schemes or in their private savings, that they are actually used this way. So that's why there needs to be more of awareness raising from the individual client and also to the policymakers who are sort of setting the frameworks for making this profitable in the market.
Well, but if I'm a pension fund, I could anyway shift my investments later to a company which is more profitable.
That's also an argument that most of them use. When it comes to carbon bubble, well, we see this on the right, we don't think it's very big, but anyway, we will be able to get out. And investors and financial community also have this herd mentality that's being talked about. Yeah. So that means that if you apply that to this occasion, is that if everyone or most people think that we can continue staying in these because we're making such a nice profit of this, and it is from currently it is making a lot of profit for them to have it in portfolios, and we can get out when it's time. But everybody can understand that if everybody wants to get out at the same time, if it's another Katrina storm or if it's a fall in oil prices, and more possibly what's happening that the prices on solar and so on are going down so fast that it's actually more competitive to shift your investments to those than staying into fossils. So if you are too late, you will be buying too expensively and you will not be able to sell at the right price. So that's a big financial risk to think that you will be able to get out when we want to get out.
How many? I think David was first.
Thank you. So given that the financial sector has accumulated a lot of capital and has a lot, big potential to invest in different areas. After 2007, we saw a large influx of investments being made in least developed countries in the sub-Saharan African continent, among those countries. And I know that WWF are working with these kinds of issues very much. My question to you is, if we want a financial sector that invests more in green energies, some of which need land to be able to be used, is there an inherent conflict here in the quest for at least some kind of return on investment and what the development studies community actually has a general consensus on right now, meaning that smallholder farmers are better off doing their thing and developing those kind of economies rather than promoting a large-scale production type of production. Do you feel like that the capital that the finance sector has accumulated is kind of something that we should be wary of and try to enforce some kind of safety mechanism to ensure that it does not have adverse socioeconomic impacts in least developed countries with maybe weaker states to enforce regulation?
No, that's you're spot on. A big dilemma and challenge. Similar things. Safeguards. Yes, we're working very much on safeguards. Again, we have to talk more about the private funds, but Sweden is also, as many countries, contributors to some of the development banks, the World Bank or the European Investment Bank and so on. So we're working on those to set standards for what they're lending to and how they're lending. There's quite an extensive work, which is sort of not so sexy, but it's in the background, and it sets a lot of standards which then private banks are following, because if those banks are not setting more tough standards, why should we, and so on. So it needs to be tough on both levels. And on terms of developing countries and so on, the future for energy, when it comes to more sustainable energy, is to have a combination of both. Now we tend to have more large scale alone and large scale of very bad kind when it comes to energy. So we need to have both the kind of local and then distributed energy systems, which are not in the interest often of the traditional energy companies, but they have the opportunity of providing energy for the poor much faster and to a better price. But of course, also developing countries also need to have the kind of energy infrastructure which we are used to create energy for their industry and development. So you need a large-scale industry energy production as well. But then they need to, of course, take the same kind of consideration that we need to do ourselves here in terms of how we are using all kind of energy production, all kind of consumption has impact on the environment. So then you need to make it's more kind of a full assessment of which one are the most sustainable. And the promising thing for Africa and African countries like that is that solar is getting so cheap that it's actually competing already now. Large-scale solar plants competing with investments from traditional energy. So we can have both large and small-scale renewable and sustainable energy.
Well, I have a follow-up question, but maybe for the sake of time, Timothy.
Two more questions, then
Yeah.
I think we have to finish.
Just really a quick one on. I wonder what you think about the Norwegian sovereign fund, and is there anything good we can or bad we can learn from it? And of course, the underlying question is, what do you see as being the role of the state, as maybe only regulators, or at some point maybe we can talk about like nationalization of some investment funds, or what do you see the role of the state in?
Of course, the Norwegian Oil Fund is a big concern for my Norwegian colleagues. They've been working with it quite intensively. For us, it's the AP funds equivalent in Sweden. But it's quite evident it's the largest fund in the world, who are owning some 2% of the global stock market. So it has huge influence, both in terms of directly in terms of the capital it owns and the signal it sets for if they would do this or the other. So we have, through our colleagues, tried to have, and together with both other civil society organizations, but also other investors, because it's the same there as here, that private investors are sort of looking to and waiting to see what will that governmental fund do, if it's the oil fund or the pension fund, and then we will follow, or if they are not moving ahead, why should we, and so on. So it's important that they are setting standards and going forward. And they have started to work on the issue. That's a positive way that they have started to look into, can we invest more in infrastructure, which will allow to invest more in this kind of renewable infrastructure? Can we invest more directly, have a mandate for renewables, even though they will set a fairly small summer percentage? It will be huge because they're such a huge fund. That would both be important in terms of real money, but also sending the signal. There was a decision early this year which was not as proactive as we would have hoped. So we still think that they have much more to do. And of course, you have the whole issue about the day after I came back from the IPCC conference, full of this kind of research and stuff. And I heard in the news that the Norwegian government is opening up for a new oil field where they're going to invest even more to explore, which they haven't explored yet. So, and that's not, it happens all the time. We know that it's just that when you get a sort of smack in the face, that is, on the one hand, you can discuss some proactive initiatives and so on, but at the same time, it seems so hard for a government, and the fossil fuel companies, I'm not surprised, but also for government, to say something in terms of acting on climate, but then when they have the resources, it's really hard to let go. And we discussed in the coffee break that developing countries, there might be logic for it, to use their resources because they have a situation where they need them. It's hard to see that for Norway.
I think that we have you were first.
I want really to say
Yes,
something.
and then you go first.
No, it's a very technical question, so we can skip that one.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I'm here for
I
it.
experience here in Uppsala among my friends that there's a great interest in solar cells technology, but also much frustration because of competition from China and the legislations here are also beneficial. We see Germany investing and having good impact in Africa, for instance. But it's so frustrating. I would like to say that, bring this message to that there's a really there's a need to export. We have a lot of knowledge about it here in Uppsala, and we like to export to all the world. For instance, I met one guy from Nicaragua, come from a similar town like Uppsala south side, Leon, and wants to start business exporting solar cells to that place. It's just an example.
I agree fully, and I happen to sit on the Energy Agency's board for power and fuel from the sun, elbränsle från solen, where we're discussing this very much, but about how the Swedish case is that we have done assessments of this as well. If you would be interested to see how we are actually very high from a country like Sweden on technology development, but we are very weak in commercialization and deployment. And we're trying to work on this. This is a site where we're giving out an award in Sweden and China and India and South Africa, highlighting these kind of solutions, solar and those included. But the purpose of this is to address how can we deploy these much faster. What's it take from policy, what does it take from investors, from corporates, and so on. And we have discussions with ministers and from Sweden and the agency as well as in other countries. With the case of Sweden is that we feel that we're some sort of locked into this perspective. We're great on developing these things, and then we're going to produce and we're going to export and sell to the whole world. Where we are a small country in Nordic, we can never provide all of that to the rest of the world. So we maybe need to find a way of having a different kind of role in the global value chain of developing these solutions, where we can benefit more from having this research and development and see what can we produce, how can we participate in this. Because we definitely need these kind of solutions, which we see are available from research and from entrepreneurs in Sweden. But there could be that we are a bit stuck in the way that the government wants to see. For every krona you spend on a research project or an entrepreneur, you need to show how many jobs and everything you create in Sweden. And we can get those jobs and export incomes, but maybe we need to think differently of how we get them. So I agree with the challenge and the dilemma, and we are have been working on that for many years as well.